This is Innovate NYC, live from the Columbia Startup Lab. Today, famed venture capitalist Alan Patricof explores entrepreneurship in the New York startup scene with Steve Blank, serial entrepreneur and founder of the Lean Startup Movement. You'll hear about why New York startups are best positioned to take advantage of technology, when an entrepreneur should call it quits, and what Elon Musk was like as an intern.
Welcome, everybody. Nice to have you here. This is the first in a series of which we're calling Innovate NYC, which is being brought to you from the Columbia Startup Labs, and is a concept that's been developed in the Columbia Entrepreneurship Program to just bring to the attention of people some interesting innovators, entrepreneurs that have been can share their experience with students and all those who are interested beyond that. And we're very lucky to kick off this program tonight with Steve Blank, who I'm sorry to say I've known for longer than I'd like to admit. I'm happy to know him, but it's a long time. When did we meet, Steve? What year?
About 30 years ago at Epiphany, right?
Yeah, yes. Now, what year was that?
96, so 27, 24
96, okay. 24 years ago. Time goes very fast. Steve, in a way, is one of those people who needs no introduction. He's most famous for his book on the lean, for his whole introduction of the concept of the lean startup. I mentioned the book because as I was coming here, someone handed me his book and said I should get his signature on the book, but which I didn't bring down.
You should all get a signature on one of Alan's checks. That's a lot more important.
It's too heavy a book to carry down all the way down here. But Steve and I met, as he reminded me, in 1996 when he was starting a company called Epiphany, and we were foolish enough not to invest in my former firm, which was at that time called Alan Patricof Associates. For those of you who don't know, I'm in the venture capital business and have been, this will be my 50th year in the venture business since I started my original firm in 1970. And I started a second firm in 2006 called Graycroft, which is very active in the venture capital business now. But Steve has started a whole number of companies, like Epiphany or Zilog, but the list goes on too far. But he's, in the last many years, has become a teacher and shared his knowledge with people on both coasts, which really makes it pretty interesting because he comes from, I guess, originally New York?
New York City.
Yep, New York City, but he has brought his experience to Silicon Valley and is intimately involved with what's going on there. So we've gotten a bunch of questions from students, and I have a couple of my own, so I just, you'll forgive me with some cue cards, but I thought a good way to start, actually, Steve, is to say, looking back at 1998 and 2002, when the bubble hit, and you and I both went through that, what do you think went wrong that actually caused that bubble, not that anyone really knows, and how is that climate different from 2020 that would suggest that it can or can't happen again?
Or is happening right now.
Or is happening, okay.
You know, in the 20th century, it's kind of interesting, Alan, and you lived through this, and Alan's been kind of modest. Alan was kind of the founder, one of the founders of venture capital itself in 1970. Predates almost every venture capital.
It wasn't
firm.
Called venture capital even.
Was it called Adventure Capital?
Well, it was called development capital, right, or whatever name you gave to it.
But you had those early insights that there was a business in funding early stage ventures. But I want to remind the audience who probably didn't live through this, we still use the word entrepreneur and risk capital and venture capital, but the model was completely different about how you built a startup. If you took money from investors, and I remind my students that the minute you take money from an investor, their business model now becomes yours. But the business model for their liquidity in the 20th century is you'd have to be a profitable company with revenue and profit to go public, which was the typical exit, right, for something you invested in. And therefore, what was really interesting is that your investors were teaching you how to build a profitable company. They were sitting on your board, they were like helping you hire sales and marketing and put the pieces together, and therefore that was kind of the model. In the 21st century, let's fast forward today, investors kind of, at least a good number of them, have figured out, well, wait a minute, why are we giving liquidity and upside to the public markets? Why don't we figure out how to take a lot of that ourselves by having all these up rounds, since there's a ton of capital now from sources that never existed, sovereign wealth funds, crazy Japanese investors like SoftBank, who are just going to school right now about maybe why that wasn't a good idea.
We're sitting in their home.
Right,
One of their
right.
homes.
Is that why the for sale sign is outside? But the notion of the whole model of venture and risk capital kind of changed. And by the way, this idea, I have to tell you, I'm still stunned. When I was an entrepreneur, founders didn't make any money until that end of that liquidity journey. I mean, you didn't make a dime. You worked for essentially peanuts and half price.
You're referring to the fact that selling shareholders, founders could get liquid almost ahead of the investors these days.
Unbelievable. The fact that, and we work, or is it we work, or yeah, the founder took $1 billion out of the company before there's any liquidity, or may not ever be any liquidity.
But I want to get back, unlike
What was your question?
unlike television, people who interview, they never go back to where they asked you originally. 1998 to 2002 was terrible. No one in this room experienced that. You and I did. Were the conditions there that caused that, are they prevalent today, or?
Well, this is where I was leading up, is that when the crash happened, right, there was infinite capital, and until finally people figured out that all these companies that claimed they were going to make money actually didn't really have a repeatable and scalable business model. But the damage was done in the public markets. That it was his grandma who invested in e-commerce companies got hurt as well. Now there's a bubble driven by capital, but it's private capital. And if it crashes, which might, you know, the most of the hurt will be entrepreneurs unemployed, but the public markets aren't even going to notice it.
So you think that we are in a different kind of situation
Absolutely.
today?
And which was a really surprise for me, not understanding how investors have changed and how they're making money then and now. It's a different game. You know, entrepreneurs will get hurt. I mean, the free flow of capital will eventually kind of ratchet down, and people will have to go back to the basics. I want to remind you, the lean startup model, this whole notion of being efficient with time, money, resources, et cetera, came out of the rubble of that crash, where VCs were hiding under their desk. There wasn't any capital. So how do you, in fact, increase the odds of getting product market fit right? That was what lean was about.
But how do you equate that with Reid Hoffman, who
Right.
says pour money in, build up your revenues, go hell-bent for leather, and forget about, you know, near-term profitability, and assume that the money's going to be out there to keep feeding it?
Reid works in a parallel universe where there's infinite capital. And his model, which is called blitzscaling, says, you know, screw all this stuff. We're back to 1997 and 8, when there was also infinite capital. When we had, who was the first grocery store?
Webvan.
Webvan. When Webvan could
Pulled
build.
that one out of the hat.
Thank you.
Don't test me. Yeah.
No. But remember, Webvan built and spent $800 million on distribution centers before they actually figured out whether it was a scalable business and whether the math worked. It worked because they were doing their equivalent of blitzscaling of who could go public first and generate liquidity for their investors before you even figure that out. You know, Reid's model is kind of the equivalent. I tell my students, for those companies that could raise hundreds of millions of dollars, throw out my book, because his actually will work if you're the founder and you want to take money out of your company before then.
Well, they all refer, of course, to Amazon, which did that
Right.
strategy, and it worked. And now we have public companies,
Right.
well, like, excuse me, I guess WeWork didn't get public. You have WeWork, and you have Airbnb, and you have so many other companies I could name for you, that Slack, Zoom, that have raised tons of money and are public. Many of them, like Uber and like Lyft, are experiencing losses in the public markets, and they're still surviving. So how long can that keep going? Is that going to create a bubble?
And the founders and the early investors have taken enough money off the table that for them it's a viable business model for their firms. What I remind my students is that's not going to be most of you in this room. Most of you in this room are not going to be able to raise hundreds of millions of dollars. And if not, then you should go to plan B, or actually I think plan A, which is the lean startup model is still pretty
So
applicable.
you think the lean startup model still works in today's environment?
Absolutely, but that there is an alternative model in blitzscaling that is valid if in fact you are capable of getting on that track. And that's a very narrow segment of entrepreneurs, very small segment.
How do we identify which ones fit that model and which ones should not necessarily stay in a lean startup model?
Well, you know, if you have, and I just had one of the founder funds partners come and speak at a dinner of entrepreneur educators I put together, and we really got schooled about the returns a tier one VC needs to make, which are $10 billion markets, right? If you can't imagine your startup generating a valuation of 10 or some odd billion dollars, you're probably using a lean startup model. If you could actually imagine without like smoking anything at the time, that there's a business model that actually could support either through hundreds of millions of users, or you're a Tesla or a SpaceX or invented anti-gravity, then I would kind of start testing that. Is it capable to raise, you know, tons of money whose ultimate valuation for your investors kind of match tier one funds? And as I said, I think that's a small subset.
You know, when I started Patricof in 2006, having had the experience of many years before that, we wrote into our original plan that we took the assumption that not one of our companies would go public, that everything would get sold in a private transaction. And in 14 years, I have been 100% correct. One of our companies went public 2 months ago, and that was the first one in 14 years. But we assumed we could make money, make a profit on a reasonable basis if we win at reasonable levels, use the lean startup kind of model, and shot for a realistic objective rather than counting on the blitz concepts.
Now, I want to remind your audience, the first time anybody ever saw lean startup slides was at the Patricof first conference at your house.
Was it really?
In the Hamptons. And in fact, one other VC who had just started at his company named Mark Schuster looked at those slides and went, I think I understand what I'm going to go do.
So let's carry this a little further. I get asked all the time, which I have no knowledge of, certainly not the same as you do. You really practice on both coasts. Can you give some insight? Remember, we're New York City oriented. That's the focus of this program. That's the audience. That's our market. That's where we're going to make our primary killings. What's the difference you see between, you're teaching on both coasts?
A huge difference, actually, though, you know, to an individual, not maybe not clear, but, you know, Silicon Valley still does deep tech. And by deep tech, I'm not talking about machine learning. I'm talking about serious hardware or electronic design automation software, or things that really, I mean, you could start anywhere, but really don't have a home and history in New York. But New York is very interesting. And by the way, the New York venture and entrepreneur community has at least had 3 lives. The first life with you and your peers at the time. And then the second life when Flatiron, you know, was kind of the center of innovation, which kind of got literally wiped out at the dot-com crash at the turn of the century. And then kind of, I call it the Bloomberg era, where, you know, Bloomberg's incentives and others kind of recreated another wave, which this time looks like it's going to stick regardless of what will happen. And the difference is, it's not only, I think, venture capital and entrepreneurship, but it's the fact that the financial community and other New York-centric industries that existed before were being disrupted and rapidly introduced new sets of technology that required internal entrepreneurs, people who knew fintech and machine learning and whatever, that there was a demand from Columbia and other lesser schools in New York area to kind of generate those types of individuals. You know, some of the biggest employers of AI machine learning people in New York are not startups, but they're Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan, and, you know, go down the list. And that's created an ecosystem that those people work there, spin out, start companies, et cetera. So to answer your question, New York entrepreneurs tend to focus on fintech, media, you know, real estate, all the things that New York was already strong in, but now there's an ecosystem that says, well, how do we deal with disruption and how do we beat disruptors in those markets? I'd say you go to Silicon Valley and you see some of those companies, but we didn't have those core industries that people come out of. The other thing is there are role models that come out of those industries. The other thing I also noticed is that there were more women as entrepreneurs and CEOs in New York than there are in Silicon Valley. And that's because there's more role models of women from industry and commerce. Certainly in media.
That's an interesting observation, actually.
Media and fashion and whatever, there's always been women CEOs and more prevalent, and now there are women role models that people go, oh, well, women, sure.
We're going through a period right now where we all read in the paper, Facebook is putting in thousands of people here. Amazon, in spite of not going to Long Island City, is going to put thousands in. Google, they're taking over massive real estate. Do you think we're going to get that tech flavor and environment and ethos here?
You already have it.
You think?
You have it, but remember, it's embedded in a set of other industries that also employ enormous number of people. Silicon Valley only has one industry, and it's innovation and entrepreneurship from San Jose to San Francisco. It used to be silicon, then it was, the peripherals, and then it was whatever. But I think we just kind of missed the idea. The idea is we are a company town for innovation and entrepreneurship. New York City is a company town for a series of industries, all of them becoming tech-oriented. That's what's really interesting, is that it's not like Detroit. It's more like, finance, Columbia, which was business school, was known as a finance school. Excuse me, we're no longer training sales traders or desk traders. We're training fintech people. Columbia Engineering is now, and hopefully the business school, are now going to teach people how to use Python and R and MATLAB, because that's kind of the language you need to use to kind of exist in these markets.
And of course, the fintech world is now, based on my observation, hitting insurance,
yes,
hitting real estate. I mean, we see every day.
So New York is basically re-engineering its old industries in a way that I don't think people have grasped. Is we basically dealt with disruption here in New York by going, we get it, okay, all these old jobs, you don't even, what's a trader anymore? Trader is an algorithm. What's an insurance company? It's like, oh, it's a math thing. We're running Monte Carlo simulations on what's the right offer. And New York has probably adapted better than any place in the world. It's a big idea. Re-engineered its corporations to take advantage of technology, and that's going to create a perpetual engine for individuals going in and out of companies to startups and vice versa. I think New York has a permanent future. Unlike when Boston missed its opportunity, I think New York grabbed it.
Let me interrupt you to say, when I started Graycroft in 2006, obviously I was in New York, so I was going to start in New York, but I also started in Los Angeles. Right. And in 2006, it was Silicon Valley. It was Silicon Valley and Boston. Today, honestly,
it's New York.
It's New York and Los Angeles. Silicon Valley is still Silicon Valley. I'm not taking it. Boston has lost that patina, but Los Angeles is booming, and New York are both booming in terms of technology and startups.
And the other piece of that, by the way, and I remember coming out to Silicon Valley in the 1970s. God, that seems old, doesn't it?
Any date before 2006.
But it wasn't clear whether it was going to be Silicon Valley or Boston as the center of innovation. Both had world-class engineering schools, MIT versus Stanford. Both had a long history of military innovation and government-funded innovation. Both had venture capital. But as a professor at Berkeley pointed out, Annalise Saxenian, Silicon Valley won because of the culture. Around the East Coast, Boston, one of the oldest settled places in the United States, you still went home once a month to see your parents. And they said, so how's work? And Dad, who worked at the same job for 30 years, was not prepared to hear, oh, I just quit my job to start a new one. They would put black crepe around the windows if that happened. But the same was true with investors. Investors on the East Coast, at least my experience at the time, was wanted to know where you went to school and what your parents did. And they continued to act like bankers. But the investors on the West Coast in the 1970s started to act like pirates.
Yeah, but I think that the axiom that we've given for so many years is New York is the cultural center. It's more exciting. It really has taken hold. People, maybe I'm being very paternal, very chauvinistic, if however you want to call it, but New York is people want to be here today.
Right.
They didn't want to be here.
And that's where I
in those
was
days.
going to go with
and
this
they don't,
idea.
and they don't want to live. The young
Right.
people I know are not as excited by the cultural stimulation and the life after work that exists in your area of San Francisco and the Valley in particular.
Well, I was going to use that analogy of New York versus, Silicon Valley versus Boston to make the point you just made, is that, New York has a culture of opportunity and always had. I mean, it was the center of where people immigrated to and came to this country. And I think entrepreneurs are finding the same thing. It's the most exciting urban area in the United States. You could even live in something called Brooklyn and still be part of New York.
When I grew up, everybody who lived in Brooklyn wanted to move to the east
Manhattan,
side of
right.
New York.
Right.
Now, no one wants to live there,
Right.
and I live there.
You're right. And so New York has a set of advantages that very few places in the U.S. have.
Let me go on to another question, which is relates just to your particular area. I'm going from this macro to the micro. People are developing in this audience and listening, hopefully, or viewing, new products, new services. How do you know when to cut a product or cut off a service? What are the measures you use yourself that would say, we've done the seed round, the A round, we're going for a B round, and even though money may be around, when should someone say this is not working, either shut the company down or do the famous pivot?
So, I was just talking to my class about this. If you're a founder of a company, you can't wait to show up at work when you're in the shower in the morning. And if in fact that's no longer the case, you either ought to resign as the CEO or realize that perhaps this ain't going anywhere and scaling. When you run out of gas, the company's running out of gas, and you and your investors, number one, need to have a very heart-to-heart conversation. Is it a personal problem with you, or have you really, since you're closer to the business than anybody, kind of tested A, B, C, and whatever, and don't know if there are any more moves? And that's usually an interesting conversation that entrepreneurs have a hard time having, is first coming to grips of, am I like spending more time at home than I was at work, and then no longer will jump on a red eye to see a customer because I don't think there's anything left here? Or is it that I'm just burned out? And burnout, as you know, is a real problem with entrepreneurs who work 20 hours a day for N years. Eventually you do hit that point. So that's number one. Number two is entrepreneurs kind of have a time frame that they operate in, regardless of the company. About, I don't know if you've seen this, Alan, but it was for me, my number was 3.5 years. 3.5 years is whether it worked or didn't work, I was ready to go. In some cases it was great because I had already had an IPO. In other cases was, I'm getting a little antsy and either replace me or we should shut this thing down. Some entrepreneurs have 12-year time horizons. Some unfortunately have attention deficit disorder or even
Well, that's
less.
why we get to these companies with A, B, C, D, E, F, and God knows. I don't know how many letters of the alphabet are used up, but it's a really tough problem for investors to know, and even the entrepreneurs. It's probably harder for the entrepreneur, easier for the investors, because they just can't can't raise
The worst
money.
thing that could happen for an entrepreneur, and I think the investors, is to end up in what I call the land of the living dead, right? Where you're kind of at the $5-10 million, maybe $20 million a year run rate, and next year you're going to do $22 million, and you might make 25. And the real question is, are you kind of stuck because you have the wrong comp plans for your salespeople, or you're no longer willing to take risk, or have you tapped out the total available market and you can't figure out where to pivot next or find the next thing? Alan, to be honest, you've tapped into a really interesting question you might want to think about your portfolio and history. Our entrepreneurs do they feel comfortable in having that conversation with their investors?
Never.
Yeah.
No.
And so why is that?
I use a measure. I always look at the market, the technology, and the product, and the people. And if you look at and say all three are not, you don't like the management, and you don't think, and the market is not developing like you expected, and the technology development has is now a year or two behind. That's, to me, an easy decision to say, stop putting more money in. So, one of the things that impressed me, Steve, that when I heard one of your times you talked, was this idea of telling entrepreneurs to get out and sell the product and stop building it and stop spending time. We all hear about, something can be over-engineered, but your concept of saying, get out there and find out what the customer's looking at or doesn't want or likes. What?
Well, that's the core of Lean Startup, is this idea called customer development. And so, I was a serial entrepreneur for 21 years and, built products exactly as investors implicitly told us. And here was the idea. Investors, you included, implicitly said, without ever saying these words, is startups are nothing more than smaller versions of large companies. Large companies write business plans. We want to see a plan. Large companies write 5-year forecasts. We want to see that. Large companies have, engineering forecasts for waterfall. If here's when you're going to develop the product, we want you to, when's first customer ship, when's revenue going to show up. And by the way, we funded your slides and that's what you're going to build. How hard could that be? The problem is that we essentially copied those ideas from how large companies actually shipped multiple products. But in a large company, you have a series of knowns. You know your customers, you know your competitors, you know what features customers want, etc. We actually never fundamentally understood that in a startup, you don't know any of that stuff. You have a set of opinions, and if you're really good and you're great at making slides and convincing investors, it sounds great, okay, I'll take a shot at it. But in fact, all you have is a series of untested hypotheses, which is a fancy word for you're just effing guessing on most of these things. So maybe we could reduce infant mortality of early stage ventures by actually rapidly testing some of those key assumptions about what it takes to build a business. And what are those key assumptions? Who are the customers? What features do they actually want? Not features do you think as the founder? And then, what's the right channel? And what's customer acquisition cost? And what's the right revenue model and strategy? And what kind of resources do I need? And what are the basic costs? Once you write those down, then you could get out of the building with the key ideas. There are no facts inside the building, so get the hell outside. And let's do this as a rapid process called customer development. And it doesn't mean we're going to do a giant focus group. This is a key distinction. What we're actually doing is informing the founder's vision. I don't want you to do a focus group because you'll end up with a list like this. You got this vision, VCs gave you money or about to give you money, wonderful. But really what you have on day one is a faith-based enterprise. It's a religious activity. You need to turn faith into facts by gathering evidence. And you do that with a second piece of Lean called agile engineering, which instead of building the product in a serial method that you only discover a year later that no one wanted or cared, nowadays, for almost anything, hardware or software, we could build products iteratively and incrementally and actually test those in front of customers now. And what we're testing is what will get us the most learning at any one point in time, because what we're looking for is a repeatable and scalable business model. And we use something called the business model canvas to kind of keep track of those. Those three components, customer development, agile engineering, business model canvas, are what we call the Lean Startup. And so
You summarized that. We don't have to buy that huge book. That's so heavy to carry.
So better. It took me, what I just said, took me 3 years to figure out. You could describe it now in 30 seconds.
Let me ask you another question. It's very hard. Every time we invest, and every venture capital invests, we always tell the entrepreneur, only hire A players. That's the way you're going to succeed. Don't settle for less than best. Always keep improving the quality, getting the very best. Any clues on how to get, because a young company, it's not so simple when you're at an early stage to attract A people to leave what they're doing. There's a tendency to kind of pick what you can, although you'd like to get the best, you don't always get it. Is there any tricks to how you can attract?
So I have,
besides giving options?
Well, you're the domain expert, but I'll tell you my model is completely different than the. So I don't know if anybody remembers, but Marisa Mayer in the beginning of Google was interviewed. They were doing a profile on her, and she was reviewing people to hire at early Google, and she said, "Oh, this student got a C in macroeconomics." You know, we'd never hire them at Google. I went, are you out of your effing mind? You're measuring whether they're going to be a great software engineer? So for me, Alan, when we say A players, some people think that means A grades in school. I'd rather hire the people who dropped out of school and in fact have done 4 startups, you know, and have shown the ability to learn rapidly, are intensely curious, and could go through walls. Those are the people I want on my team.
It's interesting you say that. I heard, I can't think of her name, Mary, I don't know, what's the president of General Motors speak about it 2 or 3 months ago, and she said they've changed their whole way of recruiting at General Motors. They don't go and hire people in specific niches. They want smart people, and they've changed throughout the company. It's a different strategy of recruiting, which is to try to get smart people.
And remember, you do need A's, so this is not don't get A's in class, for who's ever watching. Because in engineering, I need some but when I'm looking for an early team, I will trade anything for relentless people who are capable of focusing on a goal, but who are agile and will roll with this stuff and who will make stuff happen. Because what really matters on day one, at least the teams I built, is just get some data, test things, build it, try it, get on the airplane and do stuff. And it's almost an inverse correlation to whether they were A students in macroeconomics. What I cared about is, are they willing to learn quickly and operate with speed and urgency? Because a startup is about chaos and uncertainty and just rapid decision making with insufficient data while your investors are beating you with a stick.
Can you share with us any companies that you've come across in recent years that you would say are really good examples of companies who've done it right from the early?
Amazon, Tesla. Though Tesla's run by a crazy
And they've
person.
done it with spending a lot of money.
Yeah.
They've done the blitz.
So you know what Elon's first job was in Silicon Valley? He was my intern. Really? Yeah. And I didn't know that till I was reading his bio, and it says, oh, he worked for this crazy CEO at a game company. And I went, whoa. Whoa, that was me. I called up my ex-COO. I said, what? He said, oh, yeah, the kid you used to yell at a lot. He wrote your keyboard drivers. And then, wait a minute, it got even funnier, is after I retired doing 8 startups, somebody who ran Nissan's R&D group in Silicon Valley, this is turn of the century, 2000, said, Steve, there's this thing called electric cars going to come out. Let's do your 9th startup. And so grudgingly started meeting with him, and we met this kid in Palo Alto who had converted.
It was Elon at that time?
No, this is another, wait a minute, yeah. Who converted his Porsche 944 to an electric car, and he was dragging a lead acid battery pack behind the Porsche.
300 pounds, probably.
And his name was J.B. Straubel. He turned into the CTO of Tesla.
Do you have any opinion on impact investing, which is a hot subject at the moment?
You mean like social?
Social impact. It's the
yeah.
buzzword.
So my students all want to do some of that stuff. We created an alternative to what's called the business model canvas, called the mission model canvas for mission-oriented organizations. Because, you know, unlike businesses, you really don't have a way to measure revenue or profit, though you might be generating revenue and an income. But you do want to measure mission success and mission achievement, and there was really no formal way to do that. So we created this alternate canvas that's online. Just look up Mission Model Canvas. That actually works for government agencies and social agencies. 2 is, as I, much like you, sat on a bunch of national boards of nonprofits and local ones, and have found out that nonprofits are not just startups that don't make money. In fact, sometimes I'm in a startup that should make money. I said, why don't we just turn this into a 501c3 and be done with it? But that's a joke, Alan. You've probably said on those. But here's the difference is impact-driven startups, not when they're beginning, but when they get into execution mode, are almost always, at least the ones I've seen, whipsawed by donors' intent. That is, what does the major donor want you to do with this money?
Yeah, but there's also social impact that's being introduced into for-profit companies where they have a dual objective, which is, you know, and we see that in terms of health, in terms of education,
and climate change, and carbon neutral stuff.
But are you seeing a lot more of that as you go around both sides of the country? More in one place or another?
Yeah, so specifically, we started a program called Hacking for X, meaning we started classes that instead of students coming in and working on their own problems, they could work on problems given to them by agencies or cities, etc. We started ones called Hacking for Defense, but then we started one called Hacking for Diplomacy first, if you want to work on refugee problems from the State Department. And then we went to Berkeley and we started Hacking for Cities with the city of Oakland, where they gave us problems from the city itself. Then we created another class called Hacking for Impact, where the students were working on NGO and nonprofit problems. So the answer is not only yes, but we've created an environment to do that. The next version of this class on the West Coast will be Hacking for Oceans and Climate Change, being done at Scripps in Santa Cruz, where we're getting problems from
Plastic.
yeah, plastics in the ocean and coral reefs and etc. So yes, and I try to build a curriculum around how to solve that and capture that from students.
All right, let's wrap it up with one last question, which is the obvious question. What advice do you want to give to New York entrepreneurs in particular? Is there anything you can give in terms of a message of how they should build their company that's different than anything else we've talked about in the last half hour?
Well, I think New York entrepreneurs actually have an advantage of if you're in any of these domains of finance or media or insurance or things that the city has a long history of, you have an incredibly large pool of talent to tap into. And you have an incredible source of advisors and mentors and experienced people in a way that's much deeper than almost any other place, probably than Silicon Valley in those domains. And I would take huge advantage of that ecosystem that exists here. And in particular, also at Columbia University. There are entrepreneurship centers and there are resources and they're in the business school and then they're the engineering school. If you're associated with Columbia or other universities in New York, I would make sure you could tap into all those resources and find great VCs. And I would probably start with Graycroft and then work your way down.
I should put a plug in that under Richard Whitten in the last, 5 to 10 years, I forget how long it's been going on, there's been an attempt to bring together all of the schools of the university, of which there are, I'm sure, at least 10 or more, and to create an entrepreneurial culture at the university and to try to bring cross-fertilization. And this series is part of that. So thank you very much for coming, and we'll hopefully hear about the Lean Startup again in the next 10 years.
Great, thank you.